Welcome to another episode of the Dragonfire podcast. I am James Doolin, author of No Heart for a Thief. I am here as always with my co-host Nathan Klembara, a reviewer for the Before We Go blog, and we are joined today by Delilah Waan, author of Petition, and we're so excited to talk to you about the Greenbone Saga today. But before we get into that, Delilah, I wanted to give you a chance to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your book.
Sure. Hi, I'm Delilah, and I am the author of Petition, which is the first book in the Resonance Crystal Legacy series, which is an SBO. Oh my goodness, I get this wrong every single time. The self-published fantasy blog of SBFBO contest for this year, and it is an allocation to the Before We Go blog. So I'm very, very excited to see what everybody thinks of the book. It is a post-magic school sword and sorcery fantasy about an angry Asian female underdog fighting against privileged rich kids in a job hunt tournament. So if you enjoyed Daughter of the Empire or The Traitor Barry Cormorant or The Greenbone Saga, you might enjoy my book.
And just for anybody who's watching and might be a little worried, Nathan, you're not reviewing for Before We Go blog for Spitbo.
No, I'm not a Spiffbo judge, so no
Okay.
one should think that this is any kind of conflict of interest or anything. Yeah, I'm part of the blogging team, but not part of the Spiffbo judging team.
Yeah. And today I just finished listening to the last book of the Greenbone Saga, Jade Legacy, and I loved it so much that I wanted to get us together to talk about the Greenbone Saga. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to just talk a little bit about the books. We're going to try to start off a little less spoilery, as little as we can, but we will get into spoilers, so you are warned. We'll try to warn you before we get into too much of spoilers. But to start us off, maybe I'll start with Delilah. What is the best spoiler-free pitch you can give for Greenbone Saga and why people should read it?
Okay, so I actually wrote a really long answer for this on our fantasy because the typical pitch I think everybody has heard for the Greenbone Saga, it's like Asian Godfather with Jade magic. I think that's the one that they slapped all over the marketing, especially for Jade City. But I hated that pitch, right? And I did not read the book for ages, even though I was friends with the editor who had acquired it in the first place, because I was just like, oh, I don't know, like gangster movies, I'm not really into that. I will confess I have never actually watched The Godfather, which is, sacrilegious, I know. But what I think the Greenbone Saga really is about, as a whole, right, as a series, it's really a critical examination of how cultural beliefs and a way of life evolves over multiple generations, right? So if you look up interviews with Fonda Lee, the way she always pictures it is that it's a family saga. That's how she describes it. And Jade City really starts with a transition of power from the first generation to the next. And then we follow that transfer of power, what that means for the generation that's coming into that power, the struggles to deal with, civil war within while warding off international threats. And then we end the whole series with a transition of power from that second generation to the third one. And so really, like, if you go into Jade City for, Asian gangsters with Jade magic, you kind of are going to hit a pretty big speed bump once you get into Jade War and Jade Legacy, because that's really where the series starts getting into what I would call geopolitical fantasy, right? Because 80% of the conflict in the second and the third books really hinge on economic and political conflicts that are playing out over, months and years. Like, if you kind of look at the time scale of the books, Jade City's pretty self-contained, right? It takes place over, I think, maybe a year or two. Jade War, I think, is something like 5 or 6 years. And then by the time you get to Jade Legacy, it's something like 26 years, right? So the series really kind of evolves in its nature. But like overall, as somebody who is second generation immigrant, like it is just such a fantastic take on a lot of the cultural issues and the life experience that I have had. And yeah, anybody who loves that sort of thing, I really, really encourage you to read it, because Greenbone Saga, top 3 in my all-time favorite fantasy series.
You're still on mute, James.
The troubles of Zoom.
Yeah.
Nathan, do you have a pitch?
Yeah. Trying to think of what Delilah hasn't said, but I would say also, if you're a reader looking for epic intergenerational family fantasy set in a semi kind of modern world, this is the book that's for you. It has all of the trappings and everything that you're looking for in that epic fantasy with a big scope. But it's set in a world that's like, I think, reminiscent of like the 1980s in terms of technology, in terms of geopolitics, in terms of its worldview. So it's for people who want that epic feeling, but in a more modern setting, in a setting in a way that's written that you've probably never experienced before. I will also say that it's probably the best ever, at least in fantasy that I've read, of taking characters and aging them up and making them still feel like the people that they are, but also making them feel older and experienced as the books go on. Because as Delilah said, the books do take over, decades over the 3 books. So I don't think I've seen an author do that. I think we've seen aging happen in other fantasy books, but it never really feels like the characters are aging, or it feels like they're just completely different people now that 20, 30 years have passed. And I think that what Fonda Lee has done is so amazing in terms of how do people change in terms of the experiences they go through, about how trauma impacts individuals over a lifespan, and just the whole life history element of being alive and being a person.
Yeah, I think you both said so much that I would have said, in terms of, like, you covered the reasons why. I think the only thing I would also hit on is, if you really like complex, morally gray characters with that long arc of growth, like, I've never seen a more complex, morally gray set of characters written, because they definitely live by a code. They definitely live by their own entrenched set of morals. But from an outside perspective, you're challenged to think about, is that code something that is good for society? What does that do to the world around them? There's a lot going on. But I'd also say there's this element of trying to hold on to something that is about tradition in a world that is rapidly modernizing, that is really cool about this world, because there's this conflict. And I think the only other place I've seen it done to a certain extent is the Sword of Kaigen, where there's that juxtaposition between modernization and tradition. But I think it's done in such a more nuanced way in the Greenbone Saga. I'm arguing with myself if it's become my number one in terms of series so far.
What's really phenomenal about it is that if you think about the series, right, we're reading Greenbone Saga very much embedded in the perspective of the No Peak clan, right, the core family. But if you kind of take a step back out of it and just flip to the other side, to the side of the mountain, like, you could actually construct an entire trilogy from the mountain's perspective, and it would all still hang together. And you would probably come out of that trilogy thinking, wait, no, hang on, the mountain are the good guys, No Peak are the terrible people. What are they doing? And that's what I really love about the Greenbone Saga, that there is this dimensionality to the conflict. It's not straight up, good or bad. It's people in a situation trying to hang on to their faith, their culture, their values, their past, but moving forward in a world where the greater international stage is encroaching, that you have that development in technology that is doing away to a large extent with a lot of the traditional uses of jade. And it's fascinating to me.
Yeah, and the moral grayness of the world is so effortless in the way that Fonda Lee is able to incorporate it. Because I think, like, saying that a book has morally gray characters has kind of become a meme at this point. But the way that she does it is so real and so nuanced and so quiet. Even someone like Joe Abercrombie's morally gray characters are like in your face morally gray, you know, like they do terrible things to challenge you into thinking about what is morally gray about them. But the way Fonda Lee does it is she just kind of says, like, these are people like living their lives in this world. And she doesn't try to really, she doesn't force them to do terrible things just to make you question the ethics of that world. It all feels earned. It all feels real for how these characters would respond to these situations.
I would also say that there's this, the thing that a lot of books don't do is take a step outside of, you have these two warring clans or two large powerful bodies of political means clashing, but they also take a step outside of that to look at what that does to the common citizen and how that affects life in the world, where you're like, you're at the beck and call, you're at the whim of these very powerful people utilizing magic. And I think it also makes you question the rightness of them to have power. And it doesn't do it in this like really in your face way, but it just, there are slight ways that throughout the story, it's asking the question, is this power setup, is this power structure a good thing? And in some ways you have to argue that yes, and in some ways you have to argue that no, because it's also set up in this larger power structure of warring nations and this geopolitical context. It's so complex, and I feel like I need to dive right back in and start reading it again to try to understand everything. But given all of that, and the fact that we all seem to love the Greenbone Saga, is it given enough credit and attention?
I would say that it's appropriately rated, because I think that pretty much everybody who reads it raves about it. But I do feel like it's underhyped. I feel like there are core areas of the fantasy fandoms that have really grappled with it, engaged with it, and fell in love with it. But I do think it needs to blow up. And I think it's the type of book that has everything that it can blow up on somewhere like TikTok, where I rarely see anybody talking about the Greenbone Saga, because it does have these elements of geopolitics, but it also has elements of romance. It has elements of the kind of political court intrigue, but in a modern setting that you would expect. It has LGBTQ representation. It deals with issues of colonialism. And I don't think it's blown up as much as it should. And I think that it should blow up in the same way that, for example, the Poppy War has blown up, in the same way that ACOTAR has blown up. It really does belong in that book talk sensation because it is that good.
For me, I think the Greenbone Saga as a series has been the only series where I have felt that each book gets better with each successive book, and that the series as a whole has delivered on the hype that I've heard about it. So to contrast with the example that Nathan brought up, the Poppy War, I felt, was a series that the writing for me really did not deliver to the hype. And it's coming from two very different authors, right? But a lot of the same themes are kind of explored. Whereas I think Greenbone Saga works, and I think will stand the test of time when people have had more time to get to know it, basically. So I think maybe in a decade or two, we'll see Greenbone Saga in those all-time ranks, along with Malazan, Wheel of Time, those kind of classics. Whereas something like the Poppy War, I feel like it's getting a lot of buzz now. And R.F. Kuang is certainly very prolific and doing well to capitalize on that success. But I feel like it's not just going to be as enduring. And so I think it will get there, but we're going to probably need another decade or two for everybody to catch up.
I would argue it's kind of like the Farseer trilogy, in a way that I don't think Robin Hobb blew up immediately when she was writing the Farseer trilogy. It took time for those books to really find an audience in a large way. Of course, she had an audience from the get-go, but I think that those books, the Elderling,
The Realm of the Elderlings.
yes, the Realm of the Elderlings has had a renaissance in BookTube and TikTok and all that kind of, and all those platforms have really brought it back into a cultural relevance. I think, Nathan, I think you're correct. I think critically, Greenbone Saga has been given the credit it's due. I think that it has been given, it's won awards, it's been lauded in a lot of spaces, but I don't think it has the fandom it deserves. Hopefully, at some point, it gets an adaptation that will help bring it into that fandom. But yeah, I think it deserves a lot more attention, like you were saying.
But to your point about, oh, sorry, go on.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say, I think part of it too is that it doesn't nicely fit into a lot of the genres or subgenres that we tend to talk about, because on one hand, it's technically urban fantasy because it's set in a city, but like it's not urban fantasy in the same way that Dresden Files or most people who read urban fantasy are. And then I think most people who like those bigger epic fantasies are turned off because they think it is urban fantasy. And so I think it falls in the cracks between the subgenres that people focus on in terms of their accounts on BookTube, Book Talk, the FKA Twitter, whatever. And I think that's partly why it hasn't really found the larger audience that it could find.
Yeah, I mean, it really is epic urban fantasy, if you want to put it that way. And it's kind of interesting to me that the divide between urban fantasy and epic fantasy is so stark, right? Because I mean, it's kind of a world building detail to some extent, right? But coming back to James's point about the Farsi trilogy, right? There are a lot of very well established series that I still think are underrated. So we're seeing a resurgence, I think, in Jani Wertz's The Wars of Light and Shadow. That series, she's been writing since, I think, the late 80s/early 90s. I grew up with those books basically, but I've never seen people talk about them before until probably this year, when a whole bunch of booktubers and people on Twitter started talking up the series, with the 11th and final book coming out next year. So whatever it takes, like whether it's just more people doing deep dives on Greenbone Saga or an adaptation, as James has talked about, I do think with time, the books will stand the test of time, and the audience and the fandom will come, because it's less easy to read, I think, and get into than something like the Poppy War, because you already have multiple POVs to begin with. You have a prose style and a style of storytelling where it's not didactic, right? So if you read something like Poppy War, the themes are extremely on the nose. You know exactly on every single page what the author wants you to think about and take away from the words on the page. Whereas the Greenbone Saga doesn't do that. It presents you a situation with very real characters who react very authentically according to their values, and you're left as the reader to wrestle with the emotions that it elicits in you. And they're not, straightforward emotions to wrestle with. There are spoiler scenes that I won't talk about right now, but like they happened on the page and I was just like, what? Like, how could you do this? And then you stop and think about it and you're like, what? How could they not do this? Like, this is absolutely 100% real thing that character would do. It's true to the character. It's horrible. I don't like it as a reader, but I'm not coddled by the author. She doesn't cater to my preferences of, well, I ship these two characters, so they should get together, or I dislike this character, they are despicable, and therefore they're going to definitely get a terrible end. Like, that doesn't happen. It's not straightforward.
No, and I think some of the things that I like the most about this series are very small interactions that plot-wise mean nothing. But there are small interactions between people of this diaspora community that has been spread throughout countries by war, by colonialization, by just immigration, and policies of decades of this global political environment. And there are just these interactions that you're so embedded in this clan that believes in tradition so much, and then you're challenged with a small interaction of somebody going, but why? And it's coming at a very honest perspective as somebody who hasn't grown up in that tradition, being indoctrinated by that tradition, and this clash that is not even a large scale event in this world, but it's just this interpersonal clash that is so well depicted and has so much meaning wrapped up in it. But it's just such a small moment. I think there are so many small moments in these books that elevate character, that elevate the complexity of things. Hilo is one of your main characters. And so we're still in the non-spoilery part, or spoiler, whatever. We're still not talking about spoilers. So I'm not going to get a whole lot into it, but I love Hilo as a character. There are so many things to love about Hilo as a character, so many very positive things. And then he'll say or do something that just irks my very spirit because it is so reductive, or it's patronizing or paternalistic. There's something in it that is just really tied to who he is as a character, that is believable, that's necessary for who he is as a character. But Fonda Lee doesn't hold back that ability for you. You're not going to like this character all the time. You're not going to like everything he has to say. And that's not just morally gray, that's just human. And I love those small aspects of her characterization, of her interactions. There's just so much. I could rant about this book for a long time.
Yeah. James, you're gonna love the short story collection that she just published this summer.
Oh yeah.
Because it is just small little character moments that don't necessarily have big plot ramifications, but it's just the people, and it's a prequel to the trilogy, but it's just the people being them, and you'll love it.
Okay. I'll have to check that out, because
Yeah,
I know I'm gonna need a Jade City fix in a bit. Going back to our questions though, and I think Delilah, you might have already spoiled your answer a little bit. What is the best book in this trilogy?
I like Jade Legacy, no question. I was not enamored when I first read Jade City, and it was a really hard thing for me to admit that, because at the time when it had come out, right, there were not a lot of big fantasy series that were set in an Asian inspired world with Asian inspired cultures that were written by an own voices author. And so I went into Jade City really wanting to love it, desperately wanting to love it. And I got to the end and I went, that was solid. Am I, dying to read the next book? No, I'm not. Is it knocking off any of my favorites? No, it's not doing that. And so I had a really long stretch of time between the end of Jade City and the end of Jade War. And I think I ended up picking up Jade War purely because it was on sale. I think the ebook had been discounted down to like $2.99 or something like that. And at that point I was like, well, why not? Read Jade War, and again, I liked it better than Jade City. There were some really emotionally gut-wrenching moments in there, particularly reading it as a woman who has struggled with climbing the corporate career ladder. But at the same time, I kind of got to the end of Jade War and I had that same feeling, like, do I feel like I need to buy Jade Legacy and, blaze through it? No, I didn't. But after Jade War, I think like some of those emotions stayed with me for a really long time. Like 6 months after I'd read the book, I was still thinking about scenes and moments and character interactions, as James said, like they were coming back to me. And so I read Jade Legacy, I think at the beginning of last year. And that was the book where I got to the end and I cried and I went, this is a masterwork. This is now one of my all-time favorite fantasy series. This, you can't beat it. It's perfection.
Yeah, I think I'm the opposite. I think Jade City was my favorite book in the
Oh,
trilogy.
interesting.
And I don't know, maybe it's not like from like a critical or structural perspective, but I think for me, I had the complete opposite experience with Jade City because I absolutely fell in love with Jade City. Like I jumped right in, and I think that I love it because it was my introduction to this series. It was my introduction to this world. And I don't think that the second two books could ever really match just that feeling of just like immersing yourself with the No Peak clan and Jan Loon and all of this stuff going on. And yeah, I think it's my favorite. As much as like I appreciate what Fonda Lee was doing as she expanded her world, as it became more geopolitical, as we got deeper into, the major themes of the work. I think just the smaller, more narrow focus on just this family in Jade City was something that I gravitated to a lot more.
So I'm kind of between the two of your answers. I think, and this will be the reason why. My favorite character is Andon. And his time in Jade City is just so it's minimal. He's not a big character in book one, but the way book one ends for him just brings so much. It just brings so much discussion into the world and into that family, and it causes so much tension, and it's so well done. The final battle of Jade City, I would say it's not the biggest, no pun intended, it's not the biggest peak of the trilogy. I would say that Jade Legacy, just for the ability to land this trilogy so well, is arguably the best book. But I listened to the audiobooks, and by the way, if you're interested in audiobooks, the narration is amazing. But I listened to these stories back to back to back in the last month and a half, and the trauma of every scene is very heavy. And Jade Legacy gets to that point for me, or it at least did for me in my experience, of just being like, oh God, this is so much. And it's gonna get worse, and it's gonna get worse. And that just became a little bit too much for me at one point. I think the ending saved that book for me and made it really great. But I might fall with Jade City. I loved living in that, and I loved Andon's character arc, and he wasn't as much in Jade Legacy I wanted more focus on him. So that's my answer, I guess.
Yeah, I'm also a bit mixed on the time jumps in Jade Legacy. I saw the importance of giving us that long time span, but sometimes it also made it feel a bit disjointed for me in a way that Jade City felt a bit more holistic. I will also say that Fonda Lee, the way that she told you the time jumps, that made me do math, and I don't do math. And I was always like, how far in the future are we now? And I have to like figure out like 12 years plus 7 plus 12. Like, but yeah, in all seriousness, I understood why the time jumps existed, but sometimes it just felt a little much, a little dry.
That is the most common reaction I hear from people who did not enjoy Jade Legacy as much. I think one person that I was talking with put it the best in that they felt Jade Legacy read like a collection of short stories, right? I think that does come down to how the time jumps are handled, which you have a scene which will set up the next situation in the geopolitical conflict, and then you will have a time jump that takes you right to the next point in time where that scene happens. And that time jump, it could be months, it could be years, it could be 2 weeks, right? It just kind of depends on where those events line up, and it can be a bit jarring, I think, if you go into it kind of not really prepared for that. But in all honesty, I was awed with how Fonda Lee handled those time jumps, because as James said earlier, the characters grow through those time jumps. So you get a sense that time has passed. Things are not the same, which they of course would not be, because there has been, 8 months or 2 years between those moments. But the character is still recognizably the same character that lives through all of those time jumps, and it's just it's absolutely amazing how she does it, and it just left me in awe.
I think it's odd to me because the one thing that really struck me about Fonda Lee's writing of Jade City was the ability of her to flow from one scene to the next, from one chapter to the next, from one character to the next. And I never felt like the story was dropping. I never felt like I wanted to be somewhere else with another character. It felt like I was where I needed to be, and I didn't feel like there was any break. It almost felt like the chapters were written in cursive because they just flowed so well. And I couldn't say the same about Jade Legacy in the same way, because there are pauses, and they're pauses for a reason. I think they're very well handled. I don't think I was thrown by it as much, but I think because she's focusing on specific moments that are going to affect the future, something's going to happen in this chapter that is going to be either very good or very bad for a lot of the people in the scene. And so that causes a lot of tension. That does do that very well, but it's also it is overwhelming emotionally, because you're like, who is she gonna hurt now? And I hate to keep on bringing back up Poppy War, because I don't think any of us are enamored by Poppy War, but I see people's reaction to like, you hurt me so bad, and I never felt any of that, but I felt all of that with Jade City and Jade Lake. Like, I felt that so much because these characters were like, you don't have to do that to them. They're Fonda Lee is very cruel. And I think it's so interesting to see how people will talk about these grim, dark authors and how cruel they can be to their characters and everything. I think their cruelty is less than somebody like Fonda Lee or like Robin Hobb, who takes time to give some happiness and to give some levity and some joy and some connection in those stories, and then just destroys you. Because I think they get darker.
I would agree with that. I've read quite a few titles and series that people have termed grim dark, and I kind of finish it and I go, really? Like, was I supposed to cry? Like, I'm not feeling emotionally wrecked here. Whereas with Greenbone Saga, I definitely was emotionally wrecked at the end of the series.
Yeah, too many grimdark authors want it to be grimdark right from page one, and they forget that for you to really feel sad or feel the tragedy, you need to care about these characters first. And that means that the characters can't be 100% like jackasses from like the first page, or that they can't just be like chess pieces on a board that the author is moving around for these terrible things to happen. And I think both Robin Hobb and Fonda Lee understand that. And I think that's where the Poppy War didn't quite work for me, where I didn't really care about any of the characters or their relationships to each other in the same way that I felt about this family in the Greenbone Saga. And so when tragedy struck, even if these characters themselves did some bad things, I felt it a lot more, because I felt not only how it impacted that character that I had fallen in love with, but I also could understand the ramifications to the other people that they had close relationships with.
Yeah,
I think some of that comes down to writing style and the choice of how the story has been told, though. So if you just compare the first books in both series, Poppy War versus Jade City, a lot of the Poppy War is, for lack of a better way to put it, it's a list of things that happen to Rin. Rin is doing a thing, and the thing happens, and another thing happens, and it's just a whole list of things that happen until she gets to Sinigard, and then you start having actual conflict. Whereas from Jade City, there are lots of things happening, but conflict, and not artificial conflict, right? Deep personal conflict between the characters. It's present there from page one. And that, I think, is what makes the series so compelling for me. We don't have, I mean, there are external aggravators for conflict as well, particularly in Jade War, right, where the world starts opening up. But Jade City, the core conflict of this handing over of power of the core patriarch, you know, the memory of him just sitting in the background judging all of his grandkids and then what they're doing, like, it is really, really powerful and personal conflict. And that, I think, was what gave the plot so much impetus, right? Because you could understand what these kids, and the kids, they're effectively young adults. Well, maybe not young adults, but they're in, like, you know, their early 20s, right?
Yeah.
In that first book, they're young. They're young, and you can kind of feel the pressure that they're trying to live up to.
So I'm just going to take a look at the comparison between, say, something like The First Law versus Greenbone. I would say the First Law characters are like characters in an action movie. They're really fun to get to know too. They're complex to a certain extent, but they're really just fun to watch, to see, to like bang their heads together, to interact. I love those characters. And they're just action movie characters. Greenbone Saga are characters in a drama with action. That the action is never at the forefront. The action propels the drama. And they're so much more complex in a way. So, like, people will say Joel Abercrombie writes these really amazing characters. And I don't want to take anything away from him, because he does write very interesting, very cool characters. I don't think he writes characters at this complexity. I don't know how many people do write characters at this complexity.
Yeah, pretty much Robin Hobb, but yeah.
Seth Dickinson, I would say Seth Dickinson
Yeah.
does. I don't know if either of you have read him, but he's amazing in his characterization as well.
It's been on my TBR for the longest time, and so I definitely have to get that off of it. But yeah, James, you're right that, yeah, because Abercrombie's characters are so beloved because they're essentially cartoon characters, you know, and that's fun. But at the end of the day, I don't really care what happens to any of Abercrombie's characters. As much as I love spending time with them, I don't feel for them in the same way that I felt for Fonda Lee's characters.
Yeah. So I think that leads us really well into our spoiler talk, and just starting off with character. Who has the best character arc of the trilogy, which I think is a very hard question because there are so many great character arcs.
I'm so curious as to what you two are going to say, but I thought about this for a really long time, and I landed on Make Wen. That's where I got to.
Interesting. Okay.
Because you just look at where Wen starts, right? At the beginning, at Jade City, at her introduction. We're in spoiler territory, right? So I can talk about this.
Go for it.
Spoiler.
So the first introduction we get to Make Wen is, you assume that she is Hilo's side piece, right? Like, he's obsessed with her, and the way you get the introduction to their scene. And this actually took me aback when I first read the book, because up until that point in time, like, explicit sex scenes in fantasy, I think, is typically not well done by the majority of authors across the board. And so you kind of get this introduction to Wen, and it's an explicit sex scene. And I remember sitting there reading it, and I'm just going, really, like, did we need to see this? Could we not just have Hilo arrive at her apartment and, you know, you fade to black and you pick up when they wake up? No, but you have, like, Fonda Lee puts this whole pretty explicit sex scene in there. And I was just like, oh, right, okay, I'm just gonna turn the page, not think too much about it. Because it was tastefully done. It was not a bad sex scene by any means, but it sat in my mind for a long time as a sex scene that I did not think needed to be in the narrative. I thought when you read Jade City, you could take out the explicit part and you would still get the same thing for the book, right? But then you look at how Wen's character evolves through the series, And where they get to, like, there's this super powerful moment, right, where they get to the end of Jade War, and Hilo discovers that Wen and Shay have been going around behind his back. Wen's been helping Shay out because she wants to help the clan. She's been a stone eye, and like they're kind of looked down on because they can't use Jade, right? Like they're the rare people who are born with some sort of genetic defect where Jade does not affect them, even though the rest of the family does. She's got two brothers who are the Horn and the Pillar Man, and she's supposed to be marrying the Pillar. And so you kind of really feel her desperation of wanting to be more helpful to the clan, to really be part of, like, it's such a close, tight dynamic, a family dynamic, right? That you can't help feeling for her. Like, she's excluded from doing anything important in the clan just because Jade doesn't work on her. And the most fascinating thing about her whole arc in Jade War is how Shay and Wen turn that character flaw that she was born with, right, into her asset. And that is how a huge storyline in Jade War actually holds together. And then you get to the end of the book, and of course, like, Hilo doesn't know anything about it. He's been oblivious to it the whole time. And it all blows up, and he is super pissed because to him, he's just been like, why? I love you. I just want you to be safe. You don't need to do this, blah, blah, blah. I'm the Pillar. I will protect my woman, blah, 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 blah. And then Jade Legacy is kind of like their relationship arc there is all about, well, how do you reconcile this? Like, how do you reconcile what to Hilo has been a fundamental betrayal of his trust in Wen? And where does Wen go from here? Because these two characters love each other deeply, and they're deeply hurt. And I think there is another sex scene in Jade Legacy. Actually, there's a lot of sex scenes in Jade Legacy, let's be honest, because Hilo's like, kind of got a lot of the trauma, and so he goes to these charm girls at the club, the Velvet Lounge, or I forgot the name of the club. But he feels so betrayed by Wen that, like, they have breakdowns in marital relations, right? Like, so they're not having sex, they're not sleeping together, but there is this moment, right, where they manage to reconcile and they have sex. It is terrible sex, right? And if you look at how that sex scene is described on the page versus the one in Jade City, it is like on the opposite ends of the spectrum. But it is such a powerful emotional moment. I don't think that moment would have landed if you didn't have that sex scene in Jade City. It would not have landed. And then when you go from that second sex scene in Jade Legacy to the moment where Hilo asks her to be his Pillar Man, I was just like, oh my god, like this is like, oh, like so many feels. So make Wen.
That is a good answer. I will say, as an aside, I bought these books before I had gotten too far into Jade City for my 16-year-old nephew, and then I got to the sexy. I'm like, oh, what did I do?
Yeah.
He's 16. I'm sure he's seen things, but I'm like, I was not meaning to do that. But I think Make Wen is a very interesting character. One thing about her character is when she sent Hilo to go get Nico, and I thought for sure she was going to have a very different reaction to him coming home with Nico, having killed Nico's mother and stepfather, I guess.
Yeah.
And I think it just gives you that little hint of how determined Make Wen is, and how, like, she is down for this family and for this clan. She's not giving two shits about it. Like, there is no time where she's questioning, like, did you really have to do that? Not even, like, she's like, you did what you had to. You brought this kid back where he needed to be. And that said so much more about her character to me than anything that was explicitly on the page. That absence spoke so much. So yeah, I think that's a good choice. I struggle. I think Andin has to be mine. I think he just goes through so much. In book one, he's this little confined ball of inner turmoil who doesn't know how to deal with his sexuality, doesn't know how to deal with his his parentage, because his father, he never knew, was a soldier for, I always forget the countries, but one of the imperialist countries, and his mother died from the itches from over jade exposure. And so he's just this he's entombed in his own body. He doesn't know what to do with any of these feelings. And you get this feeling throughout the whole book that he's just going to kind of go along with it. And there are so many ways Fonda Lee could have gone with this character. She could have made him the tragic character that fulfills the destiny he's afraid to fulfill, and he ends up dying to the itches. Like, there are so many, and she clearly has that trajectory in the book ready for you to grab onto you, ready for you to think that's where she's going with this character. Then at the end of the book one, he's, no, I'm not taking my jade. I am not wearing jade. And to transition that into book two, where he's doing a little self-discovery, he's finding out more about his sexuality. He's away from home. He's learning more about he's learning more about what it means to be Cecchinese, being away from Kekon, than he did when he was embedded in Janlun. And so that aspect of his character development is really interesting to me, of how he realizes how Cecchinese he is, and understands how much that is a part of him, no matter what his parentage is, because he is living around Cecchinese people who are ostensibly Aspenian in many ways. And so that is so interesting to me. And then I thought at the end of book one, the scene where I forget the horn of like Aspenia's horn, I forget what his name is. But his jade is loose in the glove, and Make Wen is being strangled. And I thought, he's going to get the jade and he's going to fuck these people up. He's going to pick up his martial experience, and it's going to be an action scene. And no. Instead, he tries to heal, and he brings Make Wen back to life. And again, she cuts your expectations off. And then he decides that he's going to be a doctor and heal, and he becomes more part of the clan than I think he ever knew he could be, by following this path of not being in the clan, of just being a representative of the clan in some ways, but being detached in some ways. And I just think his character arc is so stunning, and especially with Jade Legacy giving him time to age, and being able to see him grow old with a partner, and being able to see him say no to becoming the Pillar Man and becoming a elected official instead. And I almost said Hilo for this, because there are some really cool things that I think she does in Jade Legacy, with especially when he loses his son. What? Rue.
Was it Rue? Yeah.
Yes. Especially when he loses his son Rue. I think there are some really cool things that she does with Hilo, addressing that. But I love Andon so much.
Yeah, I actually think that Hilo is my favorite character arc. I did go with Hilo on this, and I think it's because Hilo's character arc might be my favorite exploration of masculinity that I've read in fantasy or literature ever. As we first get introduced to Hilo as kind of the horn, he's a young man, and he's pretty much just getting to like revel in what young men want to revel in, right? Like, he just gets to run around and like beat people up, and that's what he's been taught, and he just gets to express his masculinity in that way. But very quickly things change where he is put into an authority position he never thought he'd be put in, as kind of the second son. But then he also settles down. He becomes a husband and a father. And I really liked how Fonda Lee shows him kind of grappling with this fact that he's not trained for this. He's not trained to be a father. He's not trained to be a husband. He's not trained to be an actual decision maker or leader. He's trained to be, a man who just like beats people up and just kind of runs around town and does all of that. And the way that she shows him, yes, maturing and yes, kind of maturing into that role, but at the same time, not being equipped for that, and at the same time wanting to go back to the role that he had, where there was less pressure, where there was less expectations, and he didn't have to be this kind of man versus the man that he was. And I think that it's that exploration of masculinity, how masculinity changes over the life course, that was my favorite part of probably the entire trilogy. So I did go with Hilo on that. I also did think about Shay, just because at the beginning, Shay kind of wants to stay out of it, and you're like, yay, stay out of it. And then you see her more and more embroiled into it, and you're like, please go back to how you were. So I also did think about Shay as well. But yeah, Hilo, because of the way that Fonda Lee used the decades spanning approach that she has in this trilogy to explore Hilo's masculinity across different parts of his life, that was my favorite.
Shay and Hilo, though, as sibling relationships, how perfect was that? It was like, just from the get-go, you could see how these two people, they've just been at odds their entire childhood, right? And he's just kind of like, oh, you're my stupid little sister who like always got good marks, but now you've like, tossed everything away to run away with a man, and now you're coming back and you're not even gonna like do anything for the family. How dare you wreck our parents' perfect plan of land being pillar and me being horn and you being the weather. Like this was what was meant to happen. And then like just the evolution that relationship goes through across the series, like when Shay and Wen get kidnapped, right, after they try to pull off their little coup with the film industry thing, and like he goes to 8 Mata, and he's like, please, like I will do anything, like help me save my sister. And I was just like, oh my goodness, like because the healer of Jade City would not have done that. He would not, he would have let Shay die. When he might have gone and pulled Wen out, like probably he would have gone and pulled Wen out. But there was no way that Hilo would have ever gone to the mountain for help. And the fact he did that for Shay, I was just like, so good.
It may be the father in me, but there are moments in Hilo's experience that really cut me deep. The scariest scene of the book for me is when Rue swallows a piece of jade. Like I was emotionally wrecked and waiting for this kid to die in the most horrific way, and like I was ready for this tragedy of being like, there's nothing we can do to stop that. Like I was ready for that to be this story. And the way he reacted when he found out that Rue was a Stone Eye is like, he's alive. And that just showed so much growth in Hilo. Like that moment was so wonderful. And his even like his internal monologue of like, why is this doctor acting like this is a bad thing? He's alive. And that was so wonderful and scary and all of that. And then even just the mentions, it's not even explicitly on the page of Hilo doing anything, but his starting to donate to charities for non-reactive people. It really touched me in a way that was just so profound. His wanting to be better for the son that was not there was so beautiful. And so I definitely almost went with Hilo for that, but I had such a soft spot for Andon. I couldn't switch.
This series really does tackle the parent-child dynamic extremely well,
Yeah.
because so much of what you read in epic fantasy, it's like, oh, the parents are dead, how tragic, this is an orphan and I am on a revenge quest to, like, you know, kill the people who killed my parents. And you don't have that here, and it is dealing with all of our, you know, Asian parents angst, second generation immigrant expectation angst, and I love it so much. And you know, coming back to Shay, and a really powerful moment for her and May Gwen is, can we talk about, like, trigger warnings here for abortion, but can we talk about the moment where Shay has, you know, after all this time, she's finally become involved with a man that, you know, fits into her world, right? Kind of. And she becomes pregnant, and it's not a planned pregnancy. And she's sitting here looking at her to-do list of all the things that she's got to do as weatherman to pull the No Pea clan out of trouble, because the mountain is doing all sorts of economic shenanigans to, you know, drive them into the ground. And she's just like, I can't, like, I want this baby, but I can't be a mother. I cannot be a mother. I cannot have this child and also do my job. And it is like, it is the most gut-wrenching thing to realize as a woman at that period of time in your life. And like, I cannot think of another fantasy novel that deals with this so sensitively, because, you know, a lot of the pregnancies that you kind of see depicted in fantasy, it's like, oh, well, you need an heir, so the woman just kind of becomes this vessel for like the succession in the power regime. And it is like, there's explorations of, you know, that choice. And I think the Priory of the Orange Tree had a very well handled miscarriage storyline. To be honest, I thought that was well done in Priory. But like, it's kind of the pregnancy issue, it's always so intrinsically tied to that female character's purpose in the narrative. It is never depicted as an obstacle that needs to be overcome for these ambitions and these purposes that the character has, you know, just you know, that have nothing to do with her being a woman, because all the goals that Shay had as Womenman would have been perfectly fine for Hami or, like, you know, any other male character thrust into that role. Like, they had nothing to do with her as a woman, but her journey, her that she had to face while getting there, like, it was so real. And the fact that, you know, May Gwen came with her and said, no, like, you know, I'm not demonizing you for this. Like, I understand you're doing what you have to do. And then, you know, she goes, she has the abortion, she comes out as she does the women thing. And then at the end of the book, she has a clean blade duel with Aunt Marta and she wins. Like, oh my God, like, it's just so amazing. Like, the thing that really made me emotional in reading Fonda Lee's books is that she writes every character as human first and foremost, because I read so many books and often they come like, when I see bad characterization, it usually comes from, you know, both female and male authors, or authors who I'm not certain how they identify, but they kind of put gender first before character, if that makes sense. So many of the obstacles and things and goals of the character are defined relative to their gender and their gender role in society, and it is not like that in Greenbone Saga. Like, yeah, gender is a factor, biology is a factor, she does get pregnant, but it is not the fundamental focus of the character's conflict and the plot conflict, if that makes sense.
And I think that's interesting in juxtaposition to Make Win, because in Legacy, she feels like her whole relationship with Rue is fundamentally challenged, because Rue is a Stone Eye and she feels this pressure to produce an heir. And then her relationship with Nico is inextricably just destroyed with Nico's decision to leave, because now her role of producing an heir and raising an heir has been stripped from her, and all she can do is blame herself. And so I think looking at Shay and looking at Make Win with those two aspects, it's such an interesting juxtaposition.
Yeah. Every time you guys bring up a different thing from these books, I'm like, how did Fonda Lee cram so much into 3
Right.
books? And yet it never feels like it's spiraling out of control. Like I'm always like, oh yeah, that did happen. Oh, that did happen. Like, oh yeah, they did get kidnapped. Oh yeah, they almost did die at that point. And I'm like, I can't believe she fit so much in. But yeah, James, should we move on to Dragonfire though? Are
I
we
so I really want to get to this
okay?
next question because I'm
Yeah.
interested to see what you all have to say. Because I have some thoughts. What are your thoughts of Bero as a character and his story?
I didn't care about him. I'm sorry. Especially in the beginning. I was like, I don't know why this kid is here. I mean, I do understand like plot wise and thematically, like what he was bringing to the story, but I will say that like I didn't care. I didn't care about him. If I gotta say there was one thing that I didn't care about in this book, it was Bero.
Interesting. Okay.
There is a despicable little shit, and every single time one of his POVs came up, I was just like, I do not fucking want to read about you on your, quest for, like, I don't know, power level 9,000 or whatever. But like, I have to say that, we were talking in the non-spoilery section about like the ending, and I do have to say that I appreciate that Bero made it all the way to the end and he is not suffering, because the world is not a just place. And sometimes shitty people like that do actually get to live out their days, and they do not have a character arc, and they do not change their outlook on the world. And it is fucking unfair that, Hilo died and Bero lived, and Lan died and Bero lived, but the world is just sometimes like that.
So I found it very interesting that her one POV character who is not clan was Bero, because I like she could have chosen a respectable person. She could have chosen somebody we liked or at least understood in a more clear way. But Bero was a shit in every way possible. Even the girl that we were supposed to like, that he was supposed to have a little romance with, at different points, he's like, this is taking too long. Maybe I should just sexually assault her. And like, he is a shit to his core.
He absolutely is.
And
He's
so
gross.
it was so, I think it was such an interesting decision to make this the non-clan point of view, because there are legitimate issues with clans. There are legitimate reasons why Jade ownership being racially charged and things like that, and having power structures within it, are problematic for this society. And it was just so interesting to me that you chose this awful human being to represent that. And I think if I'm still trying to understand why that decision was made. And I think it has a lot to do with wanting to explore. Bero is a cause of the clan. Bero is an effect of the clan. He is a repercussion of the clan system in a lot of ways. Not his personality and all that kind of stuff, but he grew up poor. He grew up wanting power because he saw it from Greenbones. He grew up jealous of everything that he couldn't have because of what is essentially a caste system. And it was very interesting to see the challenges to that system from somebody you hated. And I think I'm going to still have to take time to digest what that means.
I feel like that is the perfect reason for picking Bero as a character, right? Because there is something that you get from having that vitriol that he has against the clans that I don't think you would have gotten if you had picked, a non-Bero POV for a non-clan perspective. Because like, clan life is so embedded within Kikane's culture. Like, you could pick Atlantaman. I mean, they're still clan to an extent. You could pick like, actually, I don't know that you could pick a POV character from a different nationality necessarily, because a lot of that expansion into the geopolitical aspects of the story don't happen until Jade War, so you wouldn't I would struggle to see how you could do that seamlessly in Jade City.
Yeah.
But for Bero, like the character of Bero and how slimy he is and all the dubious stuff that he gets to, which, you know, if it's not straight up illegal, it's just borderline. It makes perfect sense to have somebody that could kind of go through the underbelly of that society and meet with like the worst of the worst. And like, I do like that she doesn't shy away from that, because it could have been, it could have been so easy to get a sympathetic anti-clan POV, right? Like I feel like that's what the majority of authors, given the choice, would do. They just be like, okay, well, I need to make sure my perspectives are balanced and I'm, you know, fully interrogating the issue. So let me introduce a sympathetic POV that's anti-clan. But no, like she gives you this utterly despicable character so that you really have to think about, like, you know, it's not a clear-cut right or wrong. Like, was Bero wrong to do a lot of the things that he did? I mean, a lot of the things were illegal. A lot of the things go against clan tradition. A lot of them are just straight up things that no decent basic human being would ever contemplate doing, but he does all of it. But then you go, well, is he entitled to point out all those flaws in the system that he does? Like, and yeah, like he has a right to be angry about the situation that he was born into. He has a right to be angry at how opportunities are barred to him simply because of a genetic factor that's out of his control, and that he has no viable pathway to better himself for it. And it's like Jade Legacy actually ends in a really interesting place, because I know one thing that I knew I wasn't going to get when I was reading the ending. I was like, I really, really want Nico to internalize like what Bero has done to his entire family. And I want that moment of recognition and that vengeance of seeing Nico like smash him in the face and pulp him to the ground. Like I kind of wanted that. Knew I wasn't going to get it. And the ending of where Nico's just like, I like, who is this guy? I don't care. Like, he's just some deranged dude, like raving about, you know, stuff. Like that was both perfectly realistic, and also like it was anticlimactic in a satisfactory way. I don't know if that makes any sense whatsoever, but that was how I felt.
I think I could keep on talking about this for a long time. We've already gone over time with this discussion of Greenbone. We could probably have 3 more discussions and still not even hit everything that we want to say. The last thing I want to say to anybody who's listening, one, if you're listening to the spoilers, we've spoiled a lot. But if you haven't read the books, read these damn books because they're very, very good. But with that, I think we should transition into our Dragonfire segment.
Yeah. All right, it is now time for our Dragonfire segment. This is where we do a quick rundown of topics where we only have 3 minutes to cover each topic. So for our first topic, it's what is a book or series that you would suggest to someone looking to get back into or just get into fantasy in general? So James, do you want to start us off while I pull up the timer?
I think there are a lot of standard answers that people give. I think people will say Mistborn and things like that. I'm going to say The Rage of Dragons. I think that the reason being is I think that The Rage of Dragons does something that a lot of your standard answers don't do, and it talks it touches on some cultural things that that can pull in readers who are interested in nonfiction or who are interested in literary fiction. It pulls in some really interesting cultural aspects of what's going on in this world. It is your fundamental ultimate revenge story. It has no bones about what it is, and it does that very well. It is that to its core. I will say I have not read the second book. I am really interested in getting into the second book. But I also think that this magic system is really interesting and complex, but there's this for anybody who is interested in video games or anime or anything like that, there's this really interesting, cool progressive magic system that I love. And so, yeah, I'm going to say Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter.
I feel like this is a trick question, right? Because what do they normally like to read? That's really going to dictate what I recommend. So for somebody who has never read fantasy and therefore has never experienced the whole canon of classic fantasy, right? I don't think you can go wrong with Le Guin. The Wizard of Earthsea is a classic for many reasons. I would not recommend Tolkien because it's just a little bit too much. But Earthsea, I think, would be a really, really good starting point for somebody who has read fantasy, but maybe is weary of a lot of the, a lot of genre fiction in fantasy is tending towards hard magic systems, right? So I would maybe recommend something that's closer to the historical fiction side. So KJ Parker, I think, is great. 16 Ways to Defend a Walled City it's an absolute riot. There's no magic in that, and it's just basically an engineer trying to survive. But it's got some of those really classic hallmarks of fantasy as well in terms of the world building and how all those things work. For somebody who is maybe just looking for a light read, I would recommend Melanie Cellier's Spoken Mage series. So Melanie Cellier she's more of a fantasy romance writer, and she does closed door or sweet romances, but Spoken Mage is her series, which actually is set in an original world. It's not a fairy tale retelling, and it does have an interesting hard magic system in there that is very easy to grasp because it's all to do with words having power when they're written. So you have people writing out spells, and it's a little bit like programming in that you've got your visualizations and how you write it affects what you can do with it. But her protagonist is a little bit different. So it's got a lot of great tropes that you hit.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll just jump in really fast. I think if somebody wants like epic fantasy, the wonder that fantasy can bring, Shadow of the Gods by John Gwynne. If you're someone who has read a lot of like YA books and are looking to get into more like adult fantasy, The Final Strife by Sarah Alarifi. Those were my two picks.
Very good.
All right.
See, you all cheated and went for multiple books.
It was a trick question.
Okay. Yeah. James knows that I always break that rule and I will always take multiple picks when I'm supposed to pick one. So that's just me at this point.
I feel cheated and I want another 3 minutes to go through the rest of my recommendations. So our next question, and let's put this disclaimer out there. We are not highlighting any work in progress or anything that is a struck project of Hollywood or any of the struck studios. Nathan and I don't want to speak for Delilah, but we stand with SAG and the WGA. But we do want to do a fan cast of the Greenbone Saga and highlight some actors who do some amazing work. So we're fan casting Hilo, Shay, and Andon. Nathan?
You want to go first? All right. For Hilo, I chose Jason Tobin. I'm just gonna we can just bring up productions, I guess, but he's currently starring in Warrior on HBO Max. If anybody needs a point of reference. For Shay, I said Arden Cho, and for Andon, I went with Jordan Green, who was previously on the CW show The 100. But that would be mine. And so when we're editing this, we can throw up photos or people can look them up.
Yeah.
You should go first because I'm terrible with fan casting.
Okay. I'm going to go. I actually picked somebody from Warrior as well. I'm going with Andrew Koji from, he's the lead in Warrior for Hilo. I think he brings a brutality to his role there. He has the martial arts skill. I think that he's a looming presence. I think Kalo is that, like, he's scary. He is a scary man to compete with. For Shay, I went with Karen Fukuhara from The Boys and Suicide Squad. she also has that fight training experience, but I think she also can hold herself in those scenes that are a little bit more like boardroom scenes. And then Ryan Potter, who plays Beast Boy in Teen Titan on HBO, I think would really be cool for Andon.
So I'm terrible with fan casting because I don't watch a lot of film and TV to start with, but I'm also one of the people, like, I recognize people when I see them and I don't remember their name. So I apologize in advance if you have no idea who I'm talking about. But my cop-out answer is I would like to see this cast out of Hong Kong with Hong Kong actors, because it is just like, it is so quintessentially like Hong Kong 80s gangster movie. So I think, like, for Hilo, you'd be looking at like a lot of the actors who did things like Infernal Affairs, which was a pretty big flick back in, I think it came out in the 90s or early 2000. But a lot of them would probably be too old for the role right now. There is an actor who did the lead for it. I think this got cancelled. It's a show called Into the Badlands, and I've forgotten his name. But you guys know what I'm talking about.
Daniel Wu, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I always pictured him as Lan.
Yeah. Because he was supposed to be the fight choreographer originally, and then they worked out that, like, they basically couldn't find anybody to do the role except him, and that's how he ended up starring. But I love him. And I think Fonda Lee actually ran a Twitter poll on fan casting. I forgot whether it was for Shay or 8 Mata, but it was between Ming-Na Wen and Michelle Yeoh. I think it probably was for 8 Mata, because both of those actresses are probably a little too old to play Shay from the get-go. And like, Ali Wong is actually really good. I don't know if you guys have seen her in Beef. And I do have a question mark though, because like so much of what Ali Wong does is comedic, and there's not a great deal of comedy in Greenbone Saga, but like there were some really dark moments in Beef that I thought she hit really well in terms of the emotions, and so I think she'd be great. And I'm actually not sure, but I'm sure there would be a lot of talent in Hong Kong. Or actually, you know what? I'd like to see Andon get played by a complete unknown, because roles for Asian actors they don't come up very often, and so I would like to see some sort of production that is an open call casting, and it's not only for established actors.
But wouldn't Andon have to be almost white passing based on his parentage? And so I think that's also an interesting casting issue, because Hollywood does not cast a whole lot of Asian actors who also are white passing in different ways, unless you're talking Keanu Reeves. So yeah, I think it would be hard to find a known actor to play Andon to actually hit those racial undertones of the conversation.
Yeah. And I know we've talked about this in previous episodes, I think, but it's still like the Greenbone Saga blows my mind that there hasn't been actual development on an adaptation. I know Peacock was working on it and they dropped it, according to Fonda Lee's Twitter account. But like this one seems like it's the slam dunk. You can do it cheaply. Like it's got
not a
all
whole lot of CGI,
yeah, like it's like the epic family drama. You know, I just, other than potentially like, you know, Hollywood executives being like, people won't watch an Asian show. I don't know why nobody's really tried to snatch this one up.
Yeah.
I think it comes back to that being cross genre, a lot of the series, because I think there would be difficulty selling the main storyline in areas like Hong Kong and China and Taiwan, because those like growing, like, even though like in Taiwan, right, like it's very, the themes that are being explored in this series, it's very, very core to that diaspora, that second generation immigrant experience, and it's a thing that you don't I don't think you feel as keenly if you haven't grown outside of, you know, the motherland. But like Andon's experience of being caught between two cultures, it's very, very unique to that experience, and maybe that's why.
All right. So for our next question, it's eliminate one fantasy trope, but you also have to eliminate all books that utilize that trope. So Delilah, did you want to go first?
Oh God. I don't know if this qualifies as a trope, but one thing I would like to see more of in fantasy novels, and mind you, I'm talking about just straight fantasy novels, right? I'm not even talking about fantasy romance, is I would just like characters to go in and out of romantic relationships, and the romantic relationship, whatever it is that they get into, does not result in a happily ever after, because how many people like these days just honestly like marry the first person and have a happily ever after with them? Like, I'm sorry, like I the puppy love, like the you know, the drama filled love triangles, like I don't like those either. But like it's always a resolution of it that bugs me, because you can have a perfectly good epic fantasy or sword and sorcery storyline, right? And then here comes the love interest, and then for whatever reason, like we still end up like together at the end of the book. And I would like books where the characters meet and they maybe have, you know, a fling along the way, and then they get to the end of the book and they're just like, you know what, like I don't really feel like settling down with you for the rest of my life. I would like to see other people. Let's break up in a mature fashion and go see other people.
I think you just destroyed half of literature.
I
If
know,
you're
I
removing
know.
that trope,
Entire genres just
entire
collapse.
genres gone. I went with a love story trope as well. I want to get rid of oppressor oppressed love stories. I hate it. And there are some good books that do it, but I like the unbroken would be gone. But I I can't buy into it enough. Like, I can't root for this relationship. You're in charge of the kingdom that is colonizing this area, and one of the colonized, you're like, but I love them. No, I don't care.
Yep. I chose enemies to lovers for that same reason. Like I read The Just Odd Air this summer, which just got published by Orbit, and I was like, I can't. Like, why is she in love with this man? Like, he's like partially responsible for like the massacre of her entire family. Like, how would she ever in a million years have feelings for him? So yeah, I chose the same thing. I don't like enemies to lovers, and I don't see it ever working. But
I
yeah.
feel like we all just picked love does not conquer all. I think that's the theme
Yeah.
I'm getting.
Yeah.
We're some jaded people.
Yeah.
Doesn't, I'm just like, how would you two live together with some books? Like, you have nothing in common aside from this quest. Like, I'm sorry, no.
Mom, can you tell me the story about how Dad's family killed all of your family again? Like, come on. Grandpa, how did it feel killing my other grandpa? Like, I think we could riff on that for a while, but we'll move on to, what is your controversial take on books and or publishing that you don't think should be controversial? Nathan.
All right. I don't know if this is too far away from like what the question intended, but like criticism and negative discourse is okay on social media. I feel like every time someone brings up anything even remotely critical, they get raked over the coals because people think that we should only hype up the books that we actually like and not talk about books that we don't like. But I then don't feel like there's any point in having actual conversations, reviews, or discourse if you can't go on and say like, hey, what did people think about this book, and actually read reviews and commentary from people who didn't like the book or whatever. So I would say that's probably the most controversial take that I have, that yes, I think there's ways to go about doing it, but you should be able to say things that are negative on social media about books, about publishing, etc. Yeah.
Delilah, do you want to go or do you want me to go?
You should go, because I might drop a really hot take.
I think mine is simple. I don't think it should be controversial, but I've definitely been I've had people argue with me about it. Every book is political. Every book is political. It exists within a political landscape. It is in the context of our world. The reader brings politics to it. The author brings politics to it. What is left off the page is political. Who is included in the book is political. It is all political, no matter how much you want to say it's escapism, what you're escaping from and how that relates to the context of the book. It's all political.
Yes. And who gets to escape through that
Yes.
escapism?
Absolutely. Okay. I think the entire publishing industry and the book industry has evolved to a point where it feels like authors and readers have more connection than ever because of people being able to connect directly on social media. But at the same time, it also feels like we are further away from each other than ever. And what I mean by that is you've got, with TradPub, you've got the whole issue of having to go through the querying trenches for an agent and then having to have the agent shop around the manuscript, and TradPub working on their schedule of deciding what they want to publish and why. But then on the indie side, you also have these incredible expenditure if you want to actually publish a title that can compete with all the other titles out there for reader attention. Like covers, I honestly, I don't like how that we judge books by covers instead of, you know, the actual writing on page one. And I also don't like how so many indie authors are being pushed towards paying a lot of money for editorial services, because editing is one of those things where I think for a new writer who is very new to storytelling, I'm sorry, but I don't think it is helping you. You would be better off taking the 2,000, 4,000, however much you're spending on dev, copy, proof, whatever, and spending like a tenth of that on like a really good writing workshop. Like, you will learn more doing that, and you will learn more by writing and getting reader feedback and rewriting and repeating that cycle than you would from paying an editor $2,000 or $4,000 to go through your master work just to have it come back in red pen, because all the editor will be able to tell you is this is what's not working in that story. And I'm not saying you can't learn from it, you definitely can, but it's, you know, in terms of money that you're putting in, it's not a good return on investment. And similarly, for a lot of writers who are very experienced and have cultivated an audience and know how to tell a story, that editor's voice, it becomes one voice in a chorus of many readers who can give you the same kind of valuable feedback. And so that's my hot take.
Cool. Yeah, I also want to throw in, and I don't think this is controversial, but all books should come with summaries of the previous books. That's one thing that I think, I don't know why it doesn't happen. I don't know if it's controversial. I don't know if authors don't want it or publishers just don't want it, but all books should come with summaries.
Nathan, I am happy to tell you, although it might be too long, I have like a 2,000 word summary of book one at the beginning of book two.
Nice.
So it should be a good reminder.
I want to ask James, did you struggle to do that summary as much as I did? Because I found that I thought it was going to be a straightforward exercise to write that summary. And then, you know, 3 days later, I was like, this is harder than writing the book.
Because you don't want to leave out, because there are important details to you and character growth and all that, but you got to leave them aside. What I did is I took the experience of writing a summary from querying and I applied that. And so I tried not to be too precious with it. But yeah, it wasn't easy.
That's why we wrote the book.
Yeah. So our next question, and this was an interesting one. I think, Nathan, you wrote this. What is a book set in pre-modern times that would be most improved with modern technology? And since you wrote this bastard of a question, Nathan, you have to answer it first.
Okay. I chose The Foxglove King by Hannah Witten for 2 reasons. First, I think that because it's set in a Renaissance inspired world and it's about necromancy and stuff like that. First, I think that there would be really interesting questions and themes related to necromancy, life, death, and all, but also modern technology and modern medicine. And also, Hannah Witten wrote those characters as if they were modern 20 somethings. Like the characters in this book are living during Renaissance times, but they definitely know what TikTok is, and you can't tell me otherwise. And so the way that the characters are written would just fit better in a modern setting. So that's what I went with that. So both for like a serious thematic reason, but also because the book just feels too modern in the way that the characters interact with each other.
Delilah, do you have a book?
I struggled with this, and I'll tell you why. I could not take my author hat off for this question because the reason why I write fantasy as opposed to any other genre is because I want to change something fundamental about our reality and explore what that would mean for humans and people. And so like level of technology it's a world building detail that I can't wrap my head around how the level of technology would not be integral to the story that is being told. Because if the level of technology is not important in terms of the core conflict in the book, then I don't know. I don't know. I could not wrap my head around the question. But I think what I would like to see is more fantasy series that explores how the world would change with the advent of technology. So Brandon Sanderson does this really well with his Mistborn books because you actually see the progress of technology over the series. But I would love to see what would happen to the Wars of Light and Shadow, for instance, if Jenny Wirtz ever wrote a book set far in the future beyond the last book, because there's actually a clause in the world building which specifically prevents the progress of technology. And I think it would be very interesting to see what would happen if that clause ever got overturned and what would happen to that world.
So I think you dodged the question a little bit, but
as the guest will forgive it.
No. I just picked something that I would like to see a little bit different. I want to see the Gentleman Bastards with some technology, mainly because I think there's this really cool dynamic going on in the Gentleman Bastards where you have these non-magical people coming up against magical situations, trying to undermine these power structures in society and benefit in whatever way they can. And I think it could be really cool to analyze what if they had access to tech in combating that magic? And so that conflict between technology and magic could be really cool in that heist situation. So yeah, that's what I picked.
Awesome. All right. So then our next question is, because throughout this podcast, James and I haven't really talked a lot about other forms of books like graphic novels or manga. So we just wanted to have a short conversation about, what attracts you to manga or graphic novels, or what doesn't attract you about manga or graphic novels. And is there one that's high on your TBR that you really want to get to? So James, do you want to start us off?
So I like trippy, kind of out of the box graphic novels. And I like that because one, the art can be really weird and graphic and throw you off of what you expect. And I think the art can tell a really cool story when it's pushing you outside of your comfort zones in that way. And so I just like to explore that. I think Saga does that really well, of having like these things that are inherent to our world that we expect culturally, or we expect because of the way we are taught how things work. And it challenges those in really cool ways. So and has more to say than what's on the page because it's challenging some cultural norms, but it does it in this kind of quippy, weird, funky way. But I haven't gotten to this book yet. The Descender on my TBR. I really want to get into this. Essentially, it's this robot shows up 10 years after there was this robot invasion that really destroyed a lot of the world. And since then, robotic technology has been outlawed, and they don't know where this robot has come from, but it also kind of has some answers about what happened. And so there's this really cool, I think, going back to my interest in technology versus magic, I think there's this really cool, like, worry about technology, but technology might be the savior kind of thing that might be in there. So I'm interested in that.
So I have to confess, I don't really read manga. The last graphic novel I read would have been White Sand Volume 2. And I only read the White Sand graphic novels because it was Brandon Sanderson, and he had not, he had said that he didn't think he was going to be publishing the prose version of White Sand anytime soon. And that was an interesting experience for me because I've read both the prose version and the graphic novel version, and there are slight differences, but the experience of reading a graphic novel is very different to reading a prose novel, right? Like in a prose novel, you're so much more into the characters' heads. Whereas for me, when I read a graphic novel, it's much more about the art and how the art is evoking emotions in me, which may not actually be the emotions that I would get if I were reading it from the POV of the character in a prose novel. And so there is actually I saw Ursula Vernon, who sometimes writes under TK Kingfisher. She did a very brief illustration kind of comic strip thing about, it was like a little creature carrying a goldfish through like an infinite library. And it was just a doodle she had come up with back when, you know, the early AI generated were coming out, and it had not become the current thing that it is now. But I found the surrealness of what she was coming out with very intriguing. So probably what would make me put a graphic novel on my TBR would be something where the art can do something that the prose cannot. That would be my answer.
Yeah, I've been reading a lot of graphic novels and manga recently, but I think it's in a problematic way only because I think subconsciously I put it at a lower tier than like prose novels, because like I've been like going through a lot, like just like moving and starting a new job. So I just haven't had the brain power for prose novels. So I'll be like, oh, this is the perfect time to do something simple, like a graphic novel, right? So I have this like always this like perception that they're just simpler. But then I get into them and I'm like, wow, there's a lot going on here. Like with something like Saga, where you're just like mind blown. But the two that I've been reading most recently for the manga is Vinland Saga. And then for graphic novels, I just started getting into Monstrous by Marjorie Liu, I think is the author. So those are the two that I've been getting into most recently. But yeah, I've been trying to like challenge my perception that they're somehow simpler or easier or less intense or involved than like traditional prose novels.
I just find it easier to consume them.
Yeah.
But I don't think that there's nothing necessarily something less sophisticated about the story.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So our last question. This was our first episode where we did a deep dive on a story. I really enjoyed it. What should the next book or series that inspires our next deep dive be?
You want me to start?
Go for it.
All right. So I picked two because that's how I roll. But anyway, I picked one that I've read that I think would be great, and one that I haven't read, but I've been meaning to get to. That's why I picked two. So for the one that I've read that I think that there's a lot to explore, the Books of Babel by Josiah Bancroft, starring with Seven Ascends. I absolutely love those books. It's in the top 5 of all time for me, just like Greenbone Saga was. And I think there's a lot to dissect. For one that I haven't read, but I would really like to get to, and James, I know that you read the first one of these and you really liked it, which is The Bone Shard Daughter, and its sequels by Andrea Stewart. I've been meaning to get to that one, and if we were like, hey, we're doing an episode about it in 2 months, you have to have it done, that would actually push it out my TBR and force me to read it and actually do it. So that's why I picked those two.
Delilah, you have any suggestions?
Yes. So, the most underrated fantasy author of our day, I think, is Helen Lowe. She is a Kiwi author, and she has a 4-book series known as The Wall of Night. She has just finished the manuscript, the first pass for the 4th and final book, and it is a series and a book that I never see anybody talking about ever, and it is phenomenal. Book 1 is her adult debut, so she was published under YA imprints before, but the first book, it has world building and lore that feels as real and deep and as sweeping as things like A Song of Ice and Fire. She's got a prose style, which is it's a little Tolkien-esque, but it's not as overly purple as some other authors who are widely praised for their prose. It was a very solid debut. That only had one moment where I had to suppress an eye roll, and that was on me, not on the book. It was just a thing that I personally disliked as a reader. But books 2 and 3, again, she gets better and better with every single book. So the third book, the Daughter of Blood, just absolutely blew me away, and I would love for her books to get some more appreciation and a wider audience.
Well, we'll have to definitely look into those books then. Nathan, I do want to finish the Bone Shard Daughter trilogy, because I did really love book 1. But I'm gonna say, and I have to rep, my indie authors. I'm gonna say Illborn. I want to get into Illborn. I have heard nothing but great things about Illborn book 1 and 2. But I think, we don't need to read a whole series. We just could do a deep dive into one book, and it's thick enough that we can get enough out of it. So yeah, I wanna check out Illborn.
Awesome. Yeah, so we'll have to come to a decision and do this again soon. But thank you, Delilah, for joining us for this episode. This has been really great. It's, I think, our longest episode by far, but I think it's also one of our best. So thank you for joining us. And thank you, everyone, for listening or watching, depending on how you're consuming this right now. The Dragonfire podcast comes out every other Tuesday, so make sure that you hit that subscribe or follow button. And yeah, we're on all of your major podcasting apps and on YouTube. So thank you, James. Thank you, Delilah. And thank you, everyone. And we'll see you next time.
Check out
Thanks for
Delilah's
having me.
books.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.